Peter was covering all the issues related to ensuring that you cover the whole population of interest, sampling that population, and then getting them to take part. In this session, we're now moving on to actually collecting the data and the potential risk for measurement differences when you're using more than one mode. So I'm going to give some very brief background about what I'm focusing on in this particular presentation and also why we should be concerned about it. But the bulk of the presentation is going to cover what the underlying causes are for measurement differences when you are combining more than one mode. And I'm going to use a conceptual framework to help us understand all the different factors that can have an impact. Pam will be taking it a step further and actually looking at the evidence, but that will be in the third presentation. I'm going to finish off also with a very brief description about different strategies that can be used to design questions to minimize this risk of measurement differences. According to Ada DeLeo, who's written quite extensively on this topic, there are two main forms of mixing modes in surveys. First of all, and Peter's already mentioned this, you can use different modes for making contact and for communicating with respondents. So that's not actually collecting data, it's just trying to make sure they take part. In this presentation, I'm not going to be covering that because that doesn't have any impact on measurement. You can also mix modes when you start collecting the data using different modes. First of all, you could be collecting different data items from the same person, and this is what Peter referred to as being multi-mode. So you are collecting the same items from all the people using the same mode, but you're collecting different items using different modes, so that makes sense. So it's a face-to-face scenario where you've got a face-to-face interview and you're asking sensitive questions in a self-completion mode. As long as those sensitive questions are being asked using the same mode for all people, you haven't got a measurement problem. In fact, if anything, you're improving the data quality. What this presentation is going to focus on, however, are the last two items here. So collecting the same data items from different people or collecting the same data items from the same person at different points in time. Now, the reason why I'm focusing on those two is because this is how you're introducing a risk of differential measurement error, because people may be answering questions differently depending on the mode in which you're asking that question. So there's a potential here for reduced data comparability. So the main question that I'm going to address in this presentation is what causes measurement to be different across modes. And to answer that question, I'm going to use a conceptual framework that's been developed by Ms Gerry Nicolaas and Peter and other colleagues. It's quite a complex model. So I'm going to just build it up step by step, and I'm going to start off with a quite simple model for the question answer process. So many of you might have already seen this before, so hopefully I'm not being too repetitive. But anyway, before a respondent can answer a question, they have to comprehend the question, they have to understand what the question is about. Then they need to retrieve from their memory any information that's relevant for answering that question. And then based on the cues given in the question and the information that they're able to retrieve, the respondent must then formulate an answer. And in some cases, or most cases, that might be quite straightforward and they can go straight on to giving a response. In other cases, however, the respondent may not have thought about that particular issue for a long time and they're having to recall, try and remember, there might be problems there. Or they might be asked for an opinion that they don't readily have. This was something that was mentioned in the earlier session this morning on surveys about non-attitudes, when we're asking people to give an opinion on something they haven't thought about. And if so, that means they're going to have to make some kind of judgment before they move on to responding. Now, once they've formulated their answers, they then need to give their response, which may require them to map the answers that they've got in their heads to the response options that have been offered to them. And it might not be a clear-cut mapping process, so they might also have to edit their answer in order to fit the response options that have been offered. Now, there are a number of reasons why this process may produce different answers depending on the mode in which the question is being asked. First of all, the respondent may be reluctant to share sensitive information with an interviewer compared to self-completion modes, and that's because of the lack of privacy. Also perhaps the lack of perceived legitimacy of actually asking the sensitive question. And there's a lot of evidence in the literature actually demonstrating that interview-administered modes are more prone to social desirability bias than self-completion modes. Another reason why respondents may answer questions differently is because some modes are more likely to encourage deeper cognitive processing than other modes. So some modes, respondents may be more likely to make less effort to provide full and accurate answers. And this will depend partly on respondent ability, over which of course we have no control, but it also depends on the respondent's motivation and also on the task difficulty. And these are things that we could possibly influence and could also differ by mode. So for example, interviewers are able to motivate respondents in telephone interviews and face-to-face interviews to make that extra effort. They can encourage them to provide a full answer. They can also help with the difficult tasks. If respondents don't actually understand what is being required of them, they can give some kind of assistance. Respondents can also be helped with difficult tasks by providing response options on show cards, so by providing them with visual aids in face-to-face modes. You can't do that in a telephone interview. And there's also some evidence suggesting that if you're presenting response options visually, so on a show card, that respondents may be more likely to select options which are at the top of the list, which is called a primacy effect. And vice versa, if you're actually reading out a response list, they're more likely to select options at the bottom of the list, which is called a recency effect. So again there, how you're presenting the question, whether it's visual or oral, could have an impact on how respondents are answering that question. The difficulty of some questions can also vary by question format. Some formats are just not suitable for some modes. For example, ranking is extremely difficult to do in a telephone interview, but it's much easier, well, it's still difficult, but much easier to do that in a face-to-face interview if you can provide cards to the respondent to rank. Now, when respondents fail to invest sufficient effort for whatever reason, we refer to this as survey satisficing, and that's what you see in this bottom left-hand corner of the diagram. And a final reason for possible differences in measurement by mode relates to the context in which the question is being asked. For example, the interview can also have an impact here. So apart from the social desirability bias, something about the interview could affect how respondents are answering the question. For example, the tone of their voice, intonation, something about their non-verbal behaviour. The format of the question can also have an impact on the context, because sometimes question formats have to be changed in different modes, and then you're talking about different formats in different modes. And then finally, in self-completion modes, the respondent has control over the questionnaire, which means that they can control the order in which the questions they're answering and the speed at which they're answering. And that can also have an impact on how they're answering questions. For example, in a postal survey, they might be flicking through the whole questionnaire and changing their answers to previous questions based on what they see in subsequent questions. So that's quite a complex framework. Starting off with that simple question-answer process, we have these different influences which could result in differences in measurement when you're using one mode compared to the other mode. But to sum up, there are really four causes of mode effects presented in that framework. First of all, the extent of interview involvement, which should increase social desirability bias in face-to-face interviews and telephone interviews, but it may reduce survey satisficing. There's the use of visual versus oral stimulus. Visual presentations can help respondents with difficult tasks, but again, it provides further contextual information which could influence the respondents, so all the whole primacy and recency effects can come into play. Some question formats may be more difficult in some modes, and it's also common to adapt question formats across modes. And then finally, there are the differences across modes in respondent control over the questionnaire. So what this framework highlights really is that when we're talking about mode and mode effects, this is much more complex than just making a simple distinction between face-to-face, telephone, postal, and online. Within each of these broad categories, we need to know the extent of interviewer involvement, and we also need to know the extent to which questions and response options are being delivered visually or orally. So, for example, face-to-face interviews. Now, this is probably one of the most flexible modes that we have, because even though it's a face-to-face interviewer, there is a possibility there of using self-completion modules within it. So you can use self-administration when that's more appropriate. But also you can combine both visual and oral presentation in face-to-face interviews. So if we go for a very basic question without any show card, that's the first column there, we can see that both questions and response options are presented orally, and the respondent will also present their answer, give their answer orally. But as soon as you start using a show card with the question, then the response options change from being oral to visual, or actually in most cases it's usually visual and oral. And then the third and fourth columns, these are when we're using a self-completion module. So if you're using a paper and pencil questionnaire or a computer-assisted self-interviewing instrument, the questions and the response options are delivered visually, and the respondent is required to either write their answer or type in their answer. If it is computerized, you also have the option there of adding in oral recordings along with the visual display. So here we see various combinations of visual versus oral presentation and different levels of interview involvement as well, all within a face-to-face interview. Another example is a telephone interview. When we think of telephone interviews, we just think of oral presentation. The telephone interview is reading out the questions and the response options, and the respondent at the other end of the phone has to provide an answer. However, in theory, it's possible to send out visual aids in advance of the telephone interview. And I don't know if this is ever done at the moment, but definitely in the early days when we were looking at how to make the transition from face-to-face to telephone, researchers were aware that their face-to-face interviews included quite long response lists and show cards. So they did send out these visual aids, these show cards in advance of the telephone interview, but I don't think that really happens anymore. Although I have no experience of doing this myself, it is possible to reduce the impact of an interview in a telephone survey by using touch-tone data entry and interactive voice recognition. This is more likely to be used in market research than in social research. But with touch-tone data entry, questions and answers are still delivered orally by the interviewer, but the respondent can then select a response option by pressing an appropriate key. With interactive voice recognition, the interview can be removed altogether from the process. Recordings of the question response options can be used, and the verbal answer of the respondent is recorded. And then a final example would be an online questionnaire. When we think of online questionnaires, we just tend to think of a computerized postal questionnaire, computerized self-completion questionnaire. So everything is delivered visually and the respondent is required to type in their answers. However, it is possible, we might not be doing it yet in many cases, but it is possible to add audio. In which case then you're suddenly being able to use visual and oral presentation of questions and response options. And then finally, there's also the possibility of having a remote interviewer available if you think that would help with your data collection. So the interviewer might not be there straight away, but the respondent could request help, and there could be a remote interviewer to provide online assistance. And there's also been some interesting work looking at virtual interviewers or avatars being used as well. So this is all possibilities for the future, I think. So again, there's all these variations of how visual and oral stimuli are being combined, but also how we can introduce interviewers in self-administered modes. What this demonstrates really is that mode shouldn't be seen as a characteristic of a survey, but it's a characteristic of a question. Within the same survey, it's possible to use a variety of different combinations of visual and oral stimuli, as well as interview administration versus self-administration. How these features are being combined, though, can have an effect on how respondents are answering questions. So that will vary question by question, depending on how you've developed those questions, how you've administered those questions. I'm now going to just finish off with a brief discussion of some design strategies. So strategies for designing questions so that you can minimize the risk of measurement differences when you're using more than one mode. So probably the most well-known strategy is unimode construction, and this involves designing the questions exactly the same in each mode. So not only should the wording of the question stem be the same, but also the response options should be same across all modes, and also the instructions. So if you're using extensive interview instructions in a face-to-face interview, then you need to think how you're going to share that kind of information if you're using another mode alongside face-to-face interviewing. Check all that apply lists, which are very popular in web questionnaires, but they can't be implemented in a telephone survey because they tend to be too long. So there, if you were doing unimode construction, you would say, okay, forget about check all that apply, change each of the items in that list to a separate yes-no question, and use a series of yes-no questions both in the online version as well as the telephone version. And also the handling of don't knows has to be done the same across modes in a unimode construction. So it's either available in explicit or null modes, or it's not available at all. Now, unimode construction is probably the most commonly used method for designing questions for mixed mode surveys, but there are a few others. And one of the disadvantages of unimode construction, at least this is what some of the critics would claim, is that actually not all of the modes are being used to their fullest potential because you're having to make compromises to ensure consistency across the modes. Also, it doesn't seem to solve all the problems that you would have with interview administered versus self-completion modes, because you could still have social desirability bias and acquiescence bias differences between the two. Nor does it solve all problems associated with mixing visual and oral modes, such as primacy and recency effects. Now, the exact opposite of unimode construction is mode-specific construction. This strategy optimizes the design of the question for each mode separately. So if a mode has a specific advantage compared to the others, it is used even if it can't be used in the other modes. And here the rationale is that this method will reduce the overall error in measurement. As long as you're trying to minimize error in each mode, taking advantage of whatever features are available in those modes, overall that should be the best approach. But it does depend on very strong assumptions. First of all, you have to assume that the questions in each mode measure the same concept, but with different levels of accuracy. And secondly, the differences between modes only affects random error and not systematic error. Another strategy is called mode enhancement construction. And in this one, one mode is considered to be the main mode, and all the questions are designed to be optimal for that main mode. The other modes are used as complementary modes and are designed to be as similar as possible to the other mode, even if that means a suboptimal design for that particular mode. For example, telephone could be the main mode in a design that combines face-to-face with telephone. Because telephone is the main mode, response lists are kept short and no show cards are used in the face-to-face mode. And then finally, a generalized mode design. Here the aim is to present the same stimulus in each mode, but not necessarily the same question wording and implementation. So here you try to purposely design the questions to be different with the aim of achieving cognitive equivalence. So there they're trying to get back to what the underlying construct is. What are you really trying to measure, and how should we design questions in each of those modes in order to capture that? Edith DeLeo refers to this as a sophisticated form of mode-specific design. However, there's little known on how to do this, and there's also very little evidence of having it been done and being able to demonstrate that you are actually achieving cognitive equivalence. So as mentioned before, unimode construction is probably the most commonly used question design out of all of these. So I would like to sum up now, and there are two main things I'd like you to take away from this presentation. First of all, there are four main causes of mode effects: the extent of interview involvement, visual versus oral stimulus, question format, and respondent control over questionnaire. So when using more than one mode, you need to think about these aspects and how they could possibly have an impact on measurement. And the second thing I'd like you to take away from this presentation is that mode is a characteristic of a question. It's not a characteristic of a survey. Thank you.